Okay. Welcome to the special meeting of the City Council Rail Subcommittee. We are going to call the meeting to order with Councilmember Mueller and Councilmember Nash, myself. Welcome to all the public attendees. Our first, we are going to do regular business. We're going to approve the City Council Rail Subcommittee special meeting minutes of September 30th, 2019. And I cannot vote on that since I was not part of the Rail Subcommittee at that point. So it is all up to you, Councilmember Mueller.
Can we do that, Miss Nagaya? Can I be the only person to vote yes?
So I have checked with City Manager Starla Jerome Robinson, and I believe you can, since that is,
okay.
I don't know that we have any other choice.
Right, so I'll make the motion, I'll second it, and I'll vote yes.
Unless I saw that City Manager was on, unless there's any other comments. That's my understanding as to how we have to proceed.
Yeah, that was my understanding as well, but I think we can note in the record that Councilmember Combs was on the committee at the time, so that it's clear that Councilmember Nash was not on the rail subcommittee at the last meeting.
Abstain for this, so it's all you, Ray.
All right.
All right, thank you. So the second item on the agenda is to receive a presentation from the California High-Speed Rail Authority on the California High-Speed Rail Project from San Jose to San Francisco segment environmental impact report statement. And Renee Bale, Associate Transportation Engineer, will provide an overview of the item and introduce the high-speed rail team in attendance.
Thank you, Councilmember Nash. Good afternoon, Councilmember Mueller. So we have 5 members from the high-speed rail that are in our meeting tonight. Boris Lipkin, who's going to make the presentation, is the high-speed rail Northern California Regional Director. James Tong is the San Francisco to San Jose Project Section Project Manager. Rich Walter is the Environmental Manager. Morgan Galley is the Northern California Project Stakeholders Manager. And we have Rebecca Fleischer, who is the Northern California Outreach Representative. And they've been kind enough for them to make this presentation tonight. So I want to turn this over to Mr. Boris Lipkin for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Renee, and thank you, council members, for holding the meeting and inviting us. I'm going to, if I can, try to share my screen and put the presentation up, which I think will remove the agenda for just a second here. And as I do that, what I'm planning to share is a bit of an overview for the statewide program. I know we haven't been in front of the committee probably in a little while, so it might be helpful to just give a short update on what's going on across the state and kind of how we got to this point. And then, of course, we'll zoom in to the San Francisco to San Jose project section and, of course, what's proposed in the city of Menlo Park. And so just to give kind of a sense for those who may not know about high-speed rail, the program was approved by the voters of California back in 2008. And so our mission, it's straight out of Proposition 1A, which was the Bond Act at the time, which is to initiate the construction of a high-speed train system that utilizes an alignment and technology capable of sustained speeds over 200 miles per hour. And what the voters approved was that phase 1 of the system, which is the blue line on the map, would run from San Francisco to Los Angeles and Anaheim, and then we would advance extensions, which are called phase 2, up to Sacramento and down to San Diego. Now this program is about 500 miles in length in just the phase 1 corridor. And what the voters gave us was essentially a down payment on starting the project and getting going. And I'll give an update on kind of where we're at and what's been done so far. But the way that we've been advancing the project has been following these three principles for the entire program. So we've worked towards initiating high-speed rail service in the state as soon as possible. At the same time, we're making strategic concurrent investments that will be linked over time and provide immediate benefits. And we'll talk about an example of that in this region and in this corridor on the existing Caltrain network. And then we're positioning ourselves to construct additional segments as funding becomes available. And that one is focused on including things like advancing environmental clearance and getting ready to build additional segments of the system as we identify the funds for those. So where are we at? Out of that 500 mile system, we are currently, and this year, and this is for 2020, under construction in the Central Valley. We have 119 miles that are already under contract, and we're proposing the next 50 miles that would bring a total of 171 mile backbone into construction in the next couple of years. So that would stretch from Merced to Bakersfield. We are already working with our partners at Caltrain to electrify the Caltrain corridor and add 50 miles of electrified high-speed rail there, corridor there. And then there's the new player that has come in over the last year and is looking to break ground later this year is the addition of Virgin Trains, which is a private entity looking to build a electrified high-speed rail line. This project used to be a diesel project and now has switched to electric high-speed, just as we are, looking to connect Las Vegas to Southern California. So for a total of about 350 miles of electric rail service that's being developed in this state right now. And that puts us second behind China around the world in terms of how much rail we have in development in California. For those stretches that are not in green or in blue and have dashed lines, those are pieces of the program that are currently under development and going through the environmental clearance process. And so far this year, we have released 4 draft environmental documents stretching across the state. So we first did Bakersfield to Palmdale from down here. Then we did San Jose to Merced, Burbank to Los Angeles, and then now San Francisco to San Jose, which is the document that we're going to talk about later tonight. And then we have our second record of decision in the last year going to our board in September. That's for a stretch in the Central Valley. And the entire system will be environmentally cleared over the next 2 years. So what we're seeing in construction is substantial progress, especially over the last 18 months. As I mentioned, there's 119 miles already being built. And over that time, we've gone from about an average of 300 workers on site in any given week to in the last week of a couple weeks ago in July, we hit over 1,000 workers on site for the first time. And that's continued over the last few weeks, close to a tripling over that time period. Similarly, we have lots of construction to do, and the spending rate on sort of the amount of work that's being done has also close to tripled over that 18-month period. We've been able to maintain that during the course of the pandemic and continue to advance the work with, obviously an increased safety and social distancing and hygiene measures on the construction site. Another recent milestone in construction has been that, while we are averaging about 1,000 workers in any given week, we've now had over 4,000 construction workers during the course of the program. And so we launched a recent campaign focusing on some of their specific stories. This is available on YouTube, and really seeing some of the economic effects for those individuals and the Central Valley economy, which has always lagged behind some of the other parts of the state where the construction has been happening, has certainly had a big effect. And then last kind of big picture item on path forward, we have identified some of the funding that we need and enough to hopefully do the pieces that we're talking about in the Central Valley for the 171 and advancing the work in the other regions. This program has always needed additional funding in order to complete. And so one of the things that we've seen over the last year is new initiatives being launched on the federal side. This was a bill introduced by Representative Jim Costa, which would authorize $32 billion for high speed and higher speed corridor development, basically, over the next 4 years. A version of this has been folded into the Invest Act, which has been part of the federal one of the federal recovery acts in the House. Under sort of pre-COVID times, I would have said that we probably need a new administration before we would see additional substantial rail funding certainly for California. In today's world, what I'll say is who knows on when these things might come to fruition, but certainly we see a active federal partner as one of the necessary steps in order to complete the program. Switching to where we are kind of in our neck of the woods in Northern California, in the region that I oversee, in this part of the system, we have every stage of project development in different components of the system. We have everything from Salesforce Transit Center, which is our northern terminus in San Francisco, which is complete and open for operations. It's currently a bus terminal, but the path to getting a train to its basement is well underway as well. And of course, there's a beautiful rooftop park there. Caltrain electrification construction, which we're partnering with Caltrain on and contributing about a third of the cost towards, is about 50% complete. You've probably seen some of the poles that have gone up as part of that project, excuse me. And so we're in an oversight role there. The downtown extension, which is the rail tunnel to connect from the existing rail corridor to that Salesforce Transit Center in San Francisco, has achieved environmental clearance, and we're working with a number of partners, including Caltrain and others, on advancing that towards being ready for shovel ready and then ultimately to construction. And then we're going through the environmental clearance on the stretch from San Francisco all the way to Merced, which would connect to the Central Valley. As I mentioned, we released the San Jose to Merced draft environmental document back in April, and we've received lots of feedback on that one, and we're now going through that same process for San Francisco to San Jose, and again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. And then at the earlier planning stages in San Jose, there's a partnership with us, VTA, Caltrain, and the city there to really reimagine the vision for what Diridon Station could be, and that one is at an earlier stage of planning. And I think that just as our entire system is at various stages of development across the state, you see the same thing in these different building blocks that will come together to be the high-speed rail network in different pieces and parts of the program at several stages of development here as well. So getting to San Francisco to San Jose, here's kind of our graphic of where we're at. We have been looking at different route options that sort of build on the electrification project and add the components necessary for high-speed rail service on the peninsula. That process restarted in 2016. We hit a big milestone in last September when we identified the preferred alternative, and that was the last thing that we needed in order to issue the draft environmental document, which we did on July 10th. And we're now in the middle of the public review period, collecting comments, and then we're going to be spending about the next year after we finish collecting comments, responding to those, making any changes we need to make before bringing that back to our board of directors around September of next year for their approval. Now, what are we studying? So in the San Francisco to San Jose stretch, much of this is set for us in, frankly, in legislation and the agreements that have been made between the authority and the region and lots of entities here to electrify and share the existing rail corridor. And so we're studying what are the changes and additions needed for high-speed rail. Most of those are common elements along the corridor. And I'll talk a bit about some of those particular ones in Menlo Park. But the kind of differentiators between the two alternatives are the location of the light maintenance facility, either on the east or west side of the tracks between the alternative A and B in Brisbane, whether we include or don't include a series of a set of passing tracks between San Mateo and Redwood City, and then the approach down to Diridon Station. And so in Menlo Park, our alternatives are the same. So there's not a difference between the two here. Now, what we have in the city in particular, we're proposing to use the Caltrain electrification infrastructure. So we're not proposing any new tracks or any change in elevation, either raising or lowering the rail or any of those things. We do have some minor lateral track shifts north of Encinal. It's in the order of several feet of movement within the existing right-of-way. We are proposing to upgrade and modernize all of the existing grade crossings to allow for operation up to 110 miles an hour. So that includes installing 4-quadrant gates and completing corridor fencing anywhere that it's not currently completed. And then we also have a standalone radio site with 2 options, either at Ravenswood or at Derry Lane. And there's been feedback and back and forth with city staff around the Ravenswood location, and we're certainly taking that into account as well. Now, I'm not going to try to summarize every detail of the environmental document. It's large. It's available on the website, and our staff has certainly been available to help your staff and public review the document. I'll talk a little bit about engagement. Some of the kind of key areas that we, CEQA impacts that we have heard and just kind of talk about in the environmental documents for Menlo Park is certainly noise. We have 7 locations where we would propose sound barriers to mitigate noise impacts, especially from train horns. That gets reduced. I know the city has had interest in quiet zones. The infrastructure that I talked about with at Great Crossings would allow the city to apply for one, and that would reduce the need for other noise mitigation if the city chose to do that, but we don't assume that as a given matter because we wouldn't be the ones making that application. Vibration is really kind of focused on specific locations where there's close train frequency. We don't see that causing building damage, but certainly annoyance is a factor. And so there's a series of design mitigations involved in the document around how we make any changes to the rail corridor based on vibration impacts. A lot of that comes out in final design. And then there's a couple places where, we have some potential effects on emergency response times. And so we've proposed mitigations around vehicle priority treatments, potentially changes to fire station locations or increasing contracted services. Some of those things are very much kind of in the very specific analytical framework of what are the effects and what are the changes that emergency response providers might be making as well. Just quickly to kind of help with navigation on the where to find the document and other materials and engagement that we have. This is our homepage, www.hsr.ca.gov. Under trending topics, you'll see the San Francisco to San Jose environmental documents tab, and that's the one that you click to access the document itself. Due to COVID, we've also moved all of our engagement online, and so we have an online open house at meethsrnorcal.org. I'm not going to try to walk through all of it. There's lots of materials up there. That's certainly, we found, we did the same thing in San Jose to Merced, and we found that to be a helpful venue for folks to get a better understanding of the project section, details of the EIR as well. And then through that website, what I will mention is that we are continuing to hold open houses as well as office hours. So we've held 2 online open houses through a platform very similar to this. Our last one is this Thursday, so in a couple of days. And then we have one more, I think, set of office hours where people can sign up for individual time with staff to get insight into the document, as well as the public hearing, which is coming up in a couple of weeks. Last tool that I'll mention is we also have a interactive map tool that allows you to navigate around the project section, see what's proposed, for example, zoom into a specific city or location and get a better kind of clearer picture of what's going on with either of the 2 alternatives. Again, something that's we saw that people use this, including in comments that we got on San Jose to Merced, for example. Folks were taking screenshots of our own mapping and sending it back to us as part of their comments. And I promise I'll stop talking in just a second here. So the public comment period is open until September 9th. We just extended that time period to over 60 days, basically. The comment form as well as the document are available on our website. And I'm sure the city might be interested in submitting comments. So, excuse me, besides the online comment form, we also accept comments via the email that's on the screen here, by mail at our Northern California office, and then verbal comments at the public hearing. That's the only opportunity for those. And so I guess one thing I'll just say is I understand that we'll be taking public comment here. This is not a venue that we accept public comment for the draft environmental document. So we just ask that if folks are interested, please submit comments in written form or come to the public hearing that we put on if you want to submit verbal comments. Obviously, public comment directed towards the subcommittee is a totally different matter. We're not trying to take away your public comment. It's just that we will not be counting those because the ones that we get, we have to respond to every single one of those. So that's the quick snapshot, and our team is available to answer questions and engage in whatever dialogue the committee would like.
Betsy, we can't hear you. Your mic is off.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for the presentation, Boris. First of all, do we have any questions, Councilmember Mueller? Clarifying questions.
You can go ahead and ask questions first. I was going to ask about when is public comment going to be taken again in Menlo Park, because I think people will want to know that. And then I also saw that the extension now connects to the extension going out to Las Vegas. And I'm curious, that's not taking any California high-speed rail money. I just wanted to make sure I understood that.
Would you like me to address those
Yes,
two
please.
items first? So in terms of accepting public comment, as I mentioned on the draft environmental documents, we're accepting written comment through the channels that I listed. And then obviously we're not holding in-person meetings, so I can't come to a committee meeting in person right now. And so the other venue would be at the public hearing, which will be on August 19th. And all of that is available on that open house website. So meethsrnorcal.org for all the information on how to submit public comments and how to attend the public hearing as well. And then on your question around the Vegas project, that one is actually a pretty exciting public-private partnership. We are not contributing any funds to that one. That's a private entity that is leading the development. The sort of public side of that is in a couple different fronts. We have an agreement between us, the State Transportation Agency, Caltrans, and that project, which will do a few things. One is they're going to plan to use the right-of-way of the I-15 freeway for compensation to Caltrans. And then we're working with them on the interoperability questions and the technical side of things, where their goal is obviously not just to end sort of in Victorville, where their current end is. They want to get to Los Angeles and the sort of heart of Southern California. And so there's another connection, and I can actually throw the map back up on the screen here because it's easier to talk about it that way. That would go through Palmdale and then connect onto our system. And so what we want to make sure is when we connect in Palmdale, as our proverbial golden spike is there, that our trains, for example, from San Francisco could get over to Las Vegas, and their trains could get onto our system and go down to Los Angeles or up to Northern California as well. And so certainly not something that we're contributing funding towards, but it is a partnership that the state is helping support, and a private company that's taking the actual risk and the development of that project.
So does that mean that when this project's over, people are going to be able to get on a train here in Menlo Park? And then how long would it take for them to get to Vegas? Just curious.
Good question. So I guess one thing I'll say is they'll need to get from Menlo Park to either San Jose or Millbrae first to get onto one of our trains, as we don't have a station in the city. The trip, say from San Jose to Palmdale, is probably on the order between 1.5 and 2 hours. And then the connection to Las Vegas is probably another hour and a half, maybe, or so. I don't know their project well enough to give you a more precise answer than that, but it's probably on the verge of 3 to 4 hours. It seems like is what
So
my mental math is coming up with.
Yeah, so probably, I mean, it sounds like it's probably a 4-hour trip to get to Vegas from. Okay. See, it's funny because it's kind of a weird question. I'm not asking that because I'm like planning my trip to go to Vegas on high-speed rail. I'm asking that question because it kind of gives a practical realization of what high-speed rail is offering in terms of that trip distance. And then to go from here to, okay. All right, I think I'll go ahead and pass to Councilmember Nash.
Maybe just if I can add one thing to your note. I mean, for us, we have a requirement that our basically design speed and travel time from San Francisco to Los Angeles has to be 2 hours and 40 minutes. And so certainly from Northern to Southern California, that's the target time that we're working towards.
Okay, thank you.
Just following up a little bit more on Councilmember Mueller's question, when might that be actually realized with where someone could go to Las Vegas? Any idea?
Well, I think, again, this sort of gets into outside of our purview as an agency, and that it's their private party that's advancing that project. They've talked about breaking ground this year. If they do that and get through construction, they could conceivably get to Palmdale maybe even before we do, perhaps. What I can speak to more is the timelines that we've laid out, which is that our intent is to get from Bakersfield to San Francisco done by 2031, and then down to Los Angeles by 2033. And while, I guess the only thing I will say is those are both funding dependent. And so those are dates that, we're doing all the work, including environmental clearance, which would allow those dates to be met. And those are the critical kind of path items for us. But at some point when we need sort of big construction dollars, if those aren't available at the right time, then obviously we will start to hit delays on those schedules.
Thank you. I have one question right now, and that's, can you describe what is the standalone radio site that might be at either Ravenswood or Dairies?
Maybe I'll actually ask James Tung, who's our project manager for this project section, to take that one. I think he would do more justice to that question. James, do you want to help me out?
Yeah, a standalone radio tower is a piece of equipment we use to connect to help facilitate communication to all the trains. And so these are 100-foot masts that go up in there, very much like a simple cell tower that you might see out in the Central Valley or any cell tower. But these are spaced every 2.5 miles. That's the frequency that we have them. But essentially, it's a tall mast, and at the bottom there's going to be a kind of like a hut for systems equipment, for telecommunications equipment. And so that's kind of like the general gist of a standalone radio site.
So it's approximately 100 feet tall?
100 feet above top of rail. Yeah, so in this location at Menlo Park, because our plans are just overlaid on top of the existing Caltrain corridor, which is very low to the ground, it would just be over 100 feet.
And what is the diameter, or how big is this?
It's about a 2-foot diameter if we're looking at a monopole.
Thank you. And what are the considerations about Ravenswood versus Derry location?
Right now, we look at the environmental impacts. And so I believe the Derry Lane one, that was on top of a footprint that is currently under construction. And so given that consideration, at this point, we would choose the Ravenswood location. And we have met with Menlo Park staff who have requested a shift in that location. We're going to take that location and shift it 1,000 feet south. So about a 1/4 mile south. It's going to be still adjacent to the Caltrain tracks, but it'll be in kind of like a back parking lot area behind some of those commercial storefronts.
And Councilmember Nash, I can explain a little bit about the staff's rationale for that request, if you'd like.
Sure, thank you.
Yep. So when our staff met with High Speed Rail, I think it's probably been about 18 months ago now, they'd identified the need for this radio tower and had identified the location at the footprint Mr. Tung mentioned at Derry Lane, which is currently the site that's under construction for Station 1300. And alignment for dairy was planned to change and be modified, renamed Garwood Way. And that location is a small parking lot that was planned for the development at Station 1300. The proximity, though, to the residential uses, both across the tracks on the east side, as well as the apartments, were the main consideration and why we asked for the tower to be relocated farther south of Ravenswood, which would then be adjacent to Burgess Park and the commercial buildings on El Camino Real. So it would be farther from any residences that would be nearby. So that was the main driver, as well as hopefully the continued presence of trees that would help screen it better at the more southerly location.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And this is on Caltrain right of way?
No, it's not. We would still have to get right away for this radio tower and then provide an access easement that would go through the parking lots.
Thank you. Sounds great. So let's go to public comment at this point. Are we going to actually, okay. How are we going to do public comment?
I can help with that. I think in the past, as we've done with other committee meetings, if any of the residents or the public have any questions, they can use the raise hand feature in the toolbar. It looks like we actually already have one person with their hand up. And I believe we actually have another question in the chat, which I can read out as well. So we can start with that for those watching the video recording as well. Sorry, what were you going to say?
So will you be calling on people or will I?
I can do that. I think as host, I'm able to give them the function to talk. So it looks like in the chat, we have a question from Marcy A. She has a two-part question. The first part being, does the draft EIR assume implementation of the option C grade separation plan of Ravenswood, Oak Grove, and Glenwood, or some other grade separation plan? And two, can you please spend some more time elaborating on page 13 by sharing more of the details of the draft EIR on Menlo Park? So if we're able to bring that the presentation back up, that might be helpful as well.
I can go ahead and describe the first question. The question pertains to whether or not the draft includes the grade separation. It does not in the plans. And I just wanted to confirm that what's shown in the plans is really like kind of a snapshot in time for what we show as our design. If there are projects along the site that have been at a significant level of development, then we will show that on our drawings. But as it stands right now, our engineering plans kind of shows a snapshot from about the 2017 timeframe in terms of what we show on the plans. Other projects are sort of described in the cumulative section of our report. And that's kind of at the very end of the report. Rich, do you know what section number of the report that's in?
It's 3 point. It's
pop quiz. 3.18 was the cumulative section of the report.
Yeah, one thing I would add on the relative to the city's planning on the grade separations is that so the infrastructure within Menlo Park is relatively limited, as was summarized by Boris. The track work is at the north end of town, north of basically from Encino to Watkins. And then you have the radio tower, but that's outside. That's actually, if it ends up at the suggested city location, it's outside the right-of-way. So the infrastructure that high-speed rail would be using is essentially what Caltrain is installing right now. So it's based on, at present, the designs are based on that design.
Yeah, I guess maybe just one more thought, and wasn't sure if we were how we were dealing with public comment or questions, but on Great Steps, obviously there's lots of different Great Step projects at various stages of development up and down the corridor. We're certainly we're not proposing grade separations as part of what we need for the addition of high-speed rail. We certainly recognize the city's interest in those, and we also want to see those happen, and there's lots of work for everyone to do to continue to advance those. So we're certainly not precluding them, but we're not proposing grade separation.
There was the second part of it, which was asking to elaborate on slide 13, which I think was the environmental slide. And I just would want to ask Councilmember Nash, and to be respectful of time, do you want us to give a little bit more? What would you like us to do? I think the comment was just adding a little bit more detail of the environmental impacts in Menlo Park.
Yes, please. I think that would be helpful.
Okay, great. Just want to be respectful of time. We did highlight, some of the key impacts. These were all focused on operational impacts. There's obviously, the document's quite big, and so it goes through many other things. So we cover all the subjects that you would expect in the NEPA and CEQA document. And, there would be construction, although compared to some places along the route, the construction in Menlo Park is, the track work is movement of a couple feet. That's work within the Caltrain right-of-way, something that the city would be familiar with. The radio tower construction would be, at that location, specific as opposed to citywide. So you don't, while there would be obviously construction effects, while you're doing that, those infrastructure compared to a passing track section or a light maintenance facility or a viaduct in San Jose is relatively smaller in terms of doing that. The 4-quadrant gates, there would be some temporary construction effects working in and around the 4 at-grade crossings in Menlo Park, as well as fencing. So there could be some construction delays, just at the point of installing those. Right now there's 2-quadrant gates at all 4 of those, I believe. But this would be 4-quadrant gates, similar to what Atherton, I think, is the only, and at Fair Oaks, I think, is the only place that has 4-quadrant gates on the peninsula right now. So there's definitely, some construction noise and a little bit of construction traffic that is discussed in the document. On what's shown on the slide that we showed, the noise impacts, it's primarily, it's in part due to the trains, but the dominant source of impact is definitely associated with the horns, and you're very familiar with that from the Caltrain operation, of course, but we would have more trains. And so that's why it's calling for more noise barriers and or quiet zones, depending on if the city is interested. The rail committee members are probably very familiar that quiet zones can really only be proposed by a local jurisdiction. That's not something the railroad can initiate, but the quad gates that are proposed as part of this project would help if the city wanted to pursue that, but that would be at the city's discretion. Vibration, I wouldn't add any more to what Boris summarized there. The emergency response, this is essentially, we did an analysis in the EIR, EIS, and it looked at kind of a worst case situation in which in Menlo Park, all 4 gates are down. And looked at, and essentially, we do identify some impacts in these 2 areas. There actually is a figure in the EIR, EIS in the safety and security section that shows kind of where that is. One is slightly east of Ravenswood and Oak Grove. It's not the whole city, it's sort of clustered to the area just east of the at-grade crossings. And the delay there is that during peak hours, not necessarily all hours, you're gonna have some traffic delays, at those at-grade locations, and that's disclosed in the document. And if you have a response, fire truck or ambulance at that time, you could have some delays in getting across that particular at-grade crossing. And so that's what's identified in the EIR, EIS, and then there's a fairly extensive sort of laundry list of potential ways working with the city that that could be addressed. These are definitely the ones that jump out. We do assess, the aesthetics of the radio tower is assessed in the aesthetics section in some of the other areas. But from my judgment, aside from the inconvenience during construction, which is always, we're all familiar with that, these are the CEQA impacts that certainly jump out. And as well as on the NEPA side, there are the traffic delays that one would expect with increased gate downtime.
Are the 7 locations of the noise barriers identified in the EIR?
Yes, they are. There are some figures in the noise section that shows those locations, and there's also tables that kind of show that identify the stationing that you can then look at the specific engineering drawings if the city or others is reviewing. And it's actually more noise barriers if you don't have quiet zones and less noise barriers if you do, because the quiet zones are pretty effective at dealing with the horn noise, which is the dominant effect. So that's, but their specific locations are identified. And they're kind of cover a lot of the city. I will tell you, if you look at the figure, you'll see that it's much of the city in the scenario without quiet zones, but it's probably half the number of noise barriers if we do have a quiet zone.
I actually have a question for staff, and that is, do you know what the requirements are for the quiet zones?
Thank you, Councilmember Nash. So we have looked at quiet zones in the past, and as I understand, quad gates would definitely meet the minimum requirements for a quiet zone if they're in place at all 4 crossings. It would not eliminate the need for the trains to sound their horn as they go through the Menlo Park station, but it would eliminate the 4 at-grade crossings. There may be some other less restrictive, less costly improvements that are needed for quiet zones that we've gotten through public comments in past meetings from other folks who have investigated this in more detail. But certainly quad gates will meet the FRA requirements. And Councilmember Mueller may remember those details from prior rail meetings as well.
Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
We're talking about noise barriers, and maybe I missed it, but what is a noise barrier? Like, how big is it? What is it?
Yeah, they're generally it's a sound wall. You've seen it. I believe that the design is up to, and James, correct me if I get this, I believe it's up to 14 feet. The 12 to 14 feet is what the design is.
Okay, and when you say it's 12 to 14 feet, is that lifted up to where the train is actually going through the city? Or is that, where is it elevation wise?
Yeah, it's from, generally from grade, and it captures, it's intended to capture most of the noise movement, but it also helps with the propagation of the horns. But it's nominally from grade, so if you had the train alongside of it, 14 feet up is nominally what you would have this in effect.
So when you said that generally runs through the city, if I were going to look at an engineering design of that, I'm assuming that's not at the station, but is what you're saying that on both sides of the track there's going to be a 14-foot cement sound wall going through the city?
That is the mitigation that's proposed. It's not 100%. You'd have to look at the specific maps, but it is fairly lengthy as a proposed mitigation to get that. But yeah, it would sound walls. For much of it, you have to open it at the at-grade crossings. You have to open it at the platforms for Caltrain.
Okay, but for the portions that go through residential areas, and we're talking about if it's lifted in that grade, so like say it's going by Willow, so the train tracks there are lifted. At grade means at the level that the train is on, right?
That's right. Yeah, at the same grade as the train. Yeah.
All right, so effectively what this, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, I'm just trying to see clear vision of it. Unless I'm at the train station, what I'm looking at is basically a 14-foot wall of concrete at grade throughout the city. Is that right? On both sides of the train?
Yes, there are some other materials for sound barriers, but standard design is usually concrete.
So okay, let me jump in because I think the details here might help a little bit. So the height is different in different locations. I think Rich, your 14 feet is the highest. I don't know that it's
That's the highest. Yes. That's
yeah.
right.
So in many places it's less is needed than that. The other part is this is mitigation, and so part of what sorry, allow me please to. I know I see skepticism, so so A, it's specific locations, yes, and B, there's other trade-offs with that. So if we don't build, if we don't have barriers or we don't reduce noise, we have more noise effects. And so there's, for example, the city doesn't want sound walls, and sound walls are constantly, a topic of some places say, yep, that's great. Some places say, no, that's terrible. That's useful feedback for us as part of the draft environmental document. If that's not the right mitigation, okay, we can look at other ones. And that's where things like, I'm not saying that the city should apply for quiet zones. Again, that's a city decision. But that is one way to address those same noise effects that we don't control. So we can't take credit for it. We don't assume it. But that's other ways to solve that same issue. And so it's not, it's not something that, from a rail service perspective, it's not something that sort of the rail system needs. It's something that if we want to reduce noise from the rail system, this is, one of the things that helps do that. It's not the only thing. And so that's, useful feedback for us if that's something else that, something different that the city would like to see.
And I'd like to add one more other thing is we do identify that, certainly appreciate that there can be aesthetic effects of that. We do identify, and the noise mitigation requirements from the authority require working with the city on that design, during the final design phase. And we do also have mitigation about treatment of that talks about, the specific design of that, that might include, coloration, might include vegetation, might include other things that might soften that aesthetic effect of those, because that's definitely a concern that you or others will raise. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so far I'm coming from, and I understand from the rail service perspective, what, obviously what that is, but from the resident perspective, one of the big concerns about high-speed rail when it was coming was this creates even more of a divide in the city. Right, basically a wall going down the center of the city, and there was this, this discussion of, well, we can make it, and I for one was like, well, we'll figure out a way to make it beautiful. We'll figure out a way to that we could soften those effects. But and what I've said, there's been talk, and what people have talked about is, can we make it look like an old time tracks, can you do trellis, can you do this, can you do that? There's all this discussion about all these interesting designs, but if at the end of the day where we're getting to is that it doesn't matter how beautiful we make the base of it, you got a 14-foot sound wall on both sides of it, we pretty much got a concrete wall except for at the station. And so, I'd be very interested in hearing how we go ahead and soften that aesthetically, like from a because this is not, I can tell you from a resident perspective, and I appreciate that we're trying to soften that noise, and that's important. But I think that as you go down the peninsula, not only in Menlo Park, but in a lot of places on the peninsula, the idea that you're not even going to see a train, you're just going to see a wall on both sides that high in the air is not going to be something that's going to go over really well. So we're going to have to
it's identified as an effect, and we're looking for feedback from residents and cities in terms of, what is that trade-off and interest, of more barriers versus quiet zone, and also the feedback on where barriers may ultimately end up being, we provided, some of the mitigation thoughts that we have, but more input from the cities in terms of ways that you might soften them.
Yeah, I'll tell you, like, and for our city, like, if you're just talking about like putting ivy on it, like that isn't going to be, people are going to be like, oh, great, I got an ivy wall. I mean, the only possible way that I think people are going to be like, okay, we've softened this is if you have a wall of trees there and people see trees, as opposed to seeing the wall. But if you're at a point where you're seeing just, just my candid feedback from you, it's not going to be a very exciting thing. And I think we'll be expecting quite a bit of pushback from that on council, and you can imagine what pushback will be coming in those EIR meetings, even though it's a mitigation.
Well, mitigation can have effects, and we do disclose that in the document, so I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I guess the last thought is, I think, again, these are the absolutely fair trade-offs for us to be talking about. I mean, this is sort of the reason we propose mitigation is to lessen one issue, but if that causes a bigger issue, well, then we should do something different. I mean, I think that's the, the reality of these things. And so, we try to balance those the best we can, but obviously people will have different ways of valuing those things, and those are the right conversations to be had.
I'd be looking into trees in a big way. This is coming up near people's backyards in different areas in the city that they're just not going to be wanting to look at a sound wall. So,
and further than that, I completely agree with what Councilmember Mueller said, and it also has the very real, it divides the city, which is really something we have always worked against, and to make it united. And so this is really of concern. I have a question for you, and that's, so we are currently running, or Caltrain currently runs diesel trains on the tracks. They were supposed to be quieter as they become electric. How does what is being proposed or studied in the EIR for the high-speed rail electric trains compared to what we're currently experiencing with the diesel trains on the tracks? What is the noise level comparison?
Yeah, the individual train itself is quieter than the diesel trains that Caltrain is using, or the diesel freight trains, which you still have running on these tracks. So the individual train is just the engine noise from an electric train versus obviously a diesel engine is quieter. These are also lighter trains, so kind of their heft as they move along the tracks is this is lightweight, what they call lightweight equipment, compared to Caltrain trains, which are heavy, and certainly the freight trains, which are heavier design. So the individual train on train is less, but we do have an increase in the number of trains, and so the number of trains, the primary effect there is the horns at the at-grade crossings, and so that when you do noise analysis in the EIR EIS, it's actually a day-night noise level. So you look at not just an individual train, but you're looking at the experience during the day and the experience over a 24-hour period with a heavier weight towards noise at night. And so frequency does come into play as well. And so because the horn isn't any quieter, because that's specified by FRA regulations.
So is there any quantification of the trains given what we are currently experiencing with the number of diesel Caltrain trains and having the grade crossings without any of the quiet zones, compared to if we were to get quiet zones and the increased frequency of trains, but they're now electric trains? Obviously, Caltrain's still planning to run their diesel freights on our tracks at night, I believe.
Yes.
But at least for comparing what we currently have now with the diesel trains on the tracks compared to high-speed rail with quiet zones, is there any comparison of that is?
Yeah, there is. We do the analysis before the mitigation. So we do disclose the existing train noise with current Caltrain and freight operations. And then we also do the analysis, with the project before we apply noise barrier or quiet zones. And then we look at the noise barrier and the quiet zones as to how they would reduce that. And you get with both of those, you get really substantial reduction in effects that's in there. But we actually quantify that, and that actually is disclosed in the document.
Yeah, I mean, what you find essentially is that certainly that especially with quiet zones, that's a very effective way of reducing noise, because the main noise impact, is the horns, as Rich mentioned, that we can't, as I think the council member or your staff mentioned, at the Menlo Park station, that's Caltrain operating rules, so quiet zone doesn't affect that particular location, but the at-grade crossings are the main source of noise as trains go by, and so that not having to blow horns basically reduces a lot of that.
I'm trying to think of right now, it sounds like our two options is to either put up with the noise or to put sound walls, and neither of those desirable. And so I'm wondering if sort of how to quantify it. Councilmember Mueller.
Yeah, I think there's still some more public comment. So I see 3 hands raised.
Excellent. Let's go to public comment, please.
Great, thank you, council members. So we had one in the chat. So what we'll do is call the 2 public speakers, the 3 public speakers with their hand raised, and then the chat window. I saw that Patrick, I think, got kicked off and is trying to come back on. So while you get set up, Patrick, let's take Adrian Brandt first, and then Mickey Winkler.
Oh, there you go. I got the unmute signal. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. So listening with great interest to the discussion, wanted to bring some information about quiet zones.
Adrian, you're in a quiet zone. We can't hear you.
And so all up and down that corridor, as staff correctly pointed out, the city staffs of the individual jurisdictions that rail service runs through, each of them, or collectively, they teamed up together, whether it was county or the individual cities, and they went through the official process for getting a quiet zone. And so essentially that entire railroad is quiet zone. And you don't even necessarily need 4 quad gates. We probably would because of the traffic levels. And so that feeds into my next comment, which is the Federal Railroad Administration has a quiet zone tool online, a calculator for professional city staffs or interested members of the public that are geeky enough to fill in traffic volumes and all the details of each crossing and how many trains pass. And it spits out a number called the Quiet Zone Risk Index, the QZRI. And so that risk index actually determines and dictates which improvements the jurisdiction would have to pay for and install to qualify for the quiet zone. The basic principle being that the risk has to be less than or equal to the crossing as it was without the horns. That's a basic principle, just to make a long story short. So there are a lot of resources online that teach cities how to do this. There's over 1,000 quiet zones across the US. And interestingly, even the Virgin trains that Boris spoke about, I was just in West Palm Beach a year ago, and they have quiet zones for the Virgin trains. They're not quite high-speed rail, but they're quite fast. And so they have them there, and there's only a sign and not even quad gates. So that's because those are low volume crossings. So I would encourage the city to invest in quiet zones, because there's no way a 14-foot sound wall is going to do anywhere near the amount of sound mitigation that a quiet zone would for a train horn, because those volume levels are mandated by the federal government, as Boris pointed out, et cetera. The other point that's important to, I think, that for you guys to be aware of is that Palo Alto, also using AECOM for its grade separation studies, is looking at doing a low parapet wall, even on the viaduct options that they've studied. And their sound consultant came up with all those numbers. You can look at them, they're online. But the low parapet wall is only about 6 feet high, and it blocks the primary source of noise from passing trains, which is from the wheel rail junction, not the horn itself, because they're going to be grade separated. So they're worried about how do we block that wheel rail noise. And you could do the same thing together with a quiet zone and a low wall blocking the rail noise that comes from the wheel rail junction. You'll have fantastic sound mitigation. And so that's something you can do regardless of whether you wind up with an elevated option C or a future viaduct or whatever it is you choose to do or not do with your grade separations. So those points, I think the sound wall is, obviously, as I can tell from Councilman Mueller's reaction and so on, that's a silly investment. I think the way to go is to do the mitigation and do your quiet zones. Remember, it's the city that has the jurisdiction and the ability to impose a quiet zone, even over and above the railroad's objections. Atherton was able to get theirs through, even though Caltrain wasn't interested. City of Petaluma got theirs through, even though SMART was pushing back. And so that's something you need to know too. It's something you guys can do. It's your power. And there's really nothing stopping you from doing it now. So that would be a much better investment than ugly sound walls or whatever else. Thanks.
Thank you, Adrian.
Okay, I think we were going to take Mickey Winkler next.
Hi, Mickey, you're the public speaker.
Okay, so this sounds fantastic to me in the literal sense of the word. I have a question. After we go through these mitigations and we get grade separations, are we going to repeat this process all over again? Or can grade separation substitute for the mitigations that we're talking about now?
I'm not sure. Are you, Councilmember Nash, are you looking for us to answer some of that, or
Yes, please.
I mean, I think certainly if the rail corridor was grade separated, then the horn noise would go away, which is the major source of noise impacts. Those at the time they would have to study the exact noise effects. I think the previous speaker mentioned some of the other sources of noise, like rail wheel interface, which would is not as big of a source, but it can be a source of noise as well. And so those are the questions that would get answered as those projects come into fruition. Certainly train horn noise would go away if you're grade separated, except for the station, excuse me. The station would still have the same. Yeah. That's Caltrain operating rules.
Great, thank you. And I think last hand raised was Diana Gilmore, who also put her question in chat. So if you'd rather us read it, we're happy to do that as well.
Hi, Diana, you've been unmuted.
Okay, thank you. My first question has to do with noise, as well as everyone else's questions seem to be around noise right now. What is the comparison noise between the electrified Caltrain that's coming and then the electrified high-speed rail, or the high-speed rail train? Are they going to be of equal production of noise, or is one have higher noise than the other?
Yeah, so generally they're both electric, what are called electric multiple units, but electric trains, they're going to be very similar on the train by train basis. But one of the differences that comes with the high-speed rail proposal is we are proposing to the track work, and some of it is in the northern part of Menlo Park, is proposed to increase speeds up to 110 miles an hour, as opposed to today, the maximum speed is 79. It doesn't mean the trains would operate at 110 everywhere, but that's what the design is going to allow for. And so with the increased speed, you do increase particularly that wheel noise that Adrian was talking about. So on a train by train basis, the Caltrain, the high-speed rail trains, because they're also designed to go faster in the Central Valley, they do have a bigger electric motor. So they're a little bit noisier, but I'm not sure you'd really notice that at the speeds that, it's more about the speed that you're running. And so a Caltrain train, a high-speed rail train running at the same speed here would probably have the equivalent noise. And the only difference is the increase in speed. And Caltrain may increase speed as well, because we'd be enabling that. Yeah.
The two trains are similar in terms of the noise profile of a given train. And they're both quieter than the existing diesel trains on the tracks today. I mean, and I think Rich previously talked about the kind of accumulation of train noise. But
yep.
Could you describe the speeds through the Menlo Park? You mentioned 110 towards the northern boundary. How does that move through the city speed-wise?
James, I think you could speak to this. I think it's all up to 110 in.
So yeah, just to give 2 cents. Sorry, James, before we jump in, just to give 2 cents of background. Most of the existing Caltrain corridor is 80 miles an hour today. What we've proposed is the improvements needed to go up to 110. That's in most locations. I know James can give sort of the blow by blow on on specifics, but. And that comes from one of our requirements is those travel times that we talked about, and this drives the operating speed on the corridor and what it takes is, as I mentioned in the presentation, is some of those relatively minor track shifts and things like that that are necessary. But James, go ahead.
Yeah, not much more on that, but as we increase the speeds up to 110, and up to is the key word here, it won't be 110 the entire way, as sometimes you'd have to slow down for shorter radius curves and things like that. But as high-speed rail goes 110, Caltrain will also go 110 as well. Through Menlo Park, since high-speed rail doesn't have a station here, we expect to go at speed. But Caltrain, if they have a stop at Menlo Park, then they'll be slowing down and speeding up. So the speed for them would really quite be variable.
And does that affect the grade separation angles, the 110? Have we now changed the angle by which the trains need to come up and down to grade? And the length.
Is that a design question for the city council?
No, I think that's a question for the engineers at High Speed Rail.
We're not proposing any grade separations in Menlo Park.
Oh, and I'm not sure that the speed doesn't really, those are somewhat independent of each other, the speed of the trains and the grade. I mean, certainly at very, very high speeds, grade starts to become an issue, or very high grades, but you shouldn't have a change in grade on your grade set project, whether you're going 110 or 79. And James, correct me if any of that's wrong, but I don't see how those would have an effect on each other.
Well, we have option C, and I think that is where we're going up and down within the city. And I believe that if you're going faster, then in order to come back down to grade, that the ramp and the up ramp and the down ramp potentially may change. But I'm just asking that question as a non-engineer.
It could change the curve radii, but it's not the grade wouldn't change. The actual maximum grade would not change, but the vertical curve lengths and the horizontal curve lengths will change.
Thank you.
And I can add, so as the city was going through its grade separation study to choose option C, as you mentioned, for the hybrid proposal, we looked at the maximum speed that both Caltrain and high-speed rail would need to operate at. It's a requirement of the grant funds that we got to proceed with that study. So that those preliminary design plans did factor in the travel speeds for Caltrain and high-speed rail as proposed. So any change to the track curvature or elevation in the rail line would meet the needs of both systems till they come to pass. So just doing a check of, I think we have one more hand raised from Marcy Abramowitz. So Patrick, if you could unmute Marcy.
Sure.
And then if anybody else has comments, please enable that raise hand feature now. And then otherwise we will turn the meeting back to Councilmember Nash and Mueller after Marcy's comments.
Thank you. So can you describe what the impact on noise is if the train is elevated? So you were talking about like the mitigation, if, which could potentially be this, sound wall if we're at grade. But if the train is elevated as the city is currently exploring, does the noise then travel farther and require other considerations?
Maybe I can start, and then Rich, I'll turn it to you. I think you'll probably be able to fill in that. So I guess the global answer is, you'd have to do the noise studies to really tell the different, the circumstances that are associated with the proposed design. There are, specifics to design that could have effects on this. Certainly raising the train up in the air means that, again, you're not having the grade crossings, which is the main source of noise. And I guess this is where sort of my general knowledge runs out, and I turn to Rich on the implications of elevation in general terms on other sources of noise of trains. I'll turn that to you, but again, I would say that for detailed answers, you need to do the studies, and that's the only way to really get to the bottom line of it. But go ahead, Rich.
Yeah, you really have to, exactly. You do have to look at that net effect of, not having the horns. But if you raise up, it can propagate further out, but at the same time, and high-speed rail has this because down in, for example, in San Jose and South, not here, we do have some sections that are elevated. You can, instead of the sound walls being on the ground, outside the tracks, you can actually put them on the edge of the structure. And those actually can be quite effective at dealing with the wheel noise. If you're no longer dealing with the horn noise. So, but it all depends on the specifics on that. So you really have to just look at the design and do the evaluation.
It looks like Mickey Winkler actually has another question that she wrote in the chat. Mickey, I'm going to allow you to talk if you'd like to expand on that.
Yes, so you didn't really answer maybe I didn't put it correctly, but I am wondering if we're going to go through the system twice, now, and when we grade separate. Are we looking at a double construction project here?
Councilor Nash, did you want to take that one, or do you want me to try to weigh in? I think you're muted. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Or Ms. Nagaya, I will throw it open to both of you.
Yeah, so I can start, and then Boris or Rich, feel free to add on. But I think from what I understand from high-speed rail's proposal is that grade separations are not part of what they are proposing for either their project or as part of their mitigation measures that would be necessary to mitigate any identified environmental impacts. So the grade separation that the city has elsewhere identified would then be a separate project that would be separate construction. I know the EIR that's on the street now for high-speed rail does identify some construction impacts as well as they went through in the presentation. But I think the extent of the track work that is proposed, as they described, is also limited to the area of the city north of Encinal. So that's not to say that it's not still construction and still can be disruptive, but it wouldn't be to the extent of changing the elevation of the tracks through something like grade separation.
Yeah, I guess I now understand the question better, and thank you, Nikki, for your help with that one. I think the major phases of construction, I mean, I think what you're seeing now with electrification is a fair amount of construction work. What we're proposing is a lot less than that in terms of modifications needed for high-speed rail service. And then if you were to go forward with a grade separation project, obviously that would be a very large construction project through the town. And so that would be a future large construction phase that you would likely see. But obviously those are future decisions to be made as well.
Thank you. I see a question in the chat that is, what are the construction effects that will affect north of Encinal, and would there be a need to use or take any property during that construction?
Yeah, the construction there to move the tracks, I believe it's 1 to 3 feet in that area. Often track movement, that's often done with on-track equipment. Be done outside of normal, like peak hours for commute service is generally when you would do that work. That's not, you have equipment inside the right-of-way for that small of a shift. You should be able to keep all the the work inside the right-of-way there. We don't identify any temporary construction easements needed in that area. I checked. We do have some around the radio tower site, wherever that ends up to be, but not associated with the track work up to there. And that's the primary thing that you would see. Encino would have some construction of the gates, of the quad gates that we've been talking about right there. But a lot of that is really focused in on the Caltrain right-of-way itself for that work, as well as the track work. And short track shifts, James can correct me, but it's not a huge crew, but they often bring in on-track equipment that actually does it. And so that moves, for construction, that moves relatively rapidly because you're picking up the ties and moving them over and moving the track and basically doing it kind of one track at a time is usually the way they do that. So there would be some noise, and possibly some dust, but it's not major. You're not talking about excavation, large excavation. You're not talking about having to drive, construction piles or any of those kind of things that you would see with a lot, bigger piece of infrastructure. And so it's not dissimilar to some of the things that Caltrain might do with track maintenance. You might see really when you're talking about these small track shifts, big track shifts, that's a different story, but that's not what's proposed in Menlo Park.
Thank you.
It looks like we have another question from Adrian Brandt. Adrian, you're now the public speaker.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, just a couple of quick additional comments. Caltrain has already moved to 110-mile-an-hour track design standard. So
Adrian, I think you cut out.
Yeah.
One grade to another. You imagine, so those vertical curve lengths are actually increased with increased speed, but they're already going for the 110 standard. And then regarding the questions or the comments that came up about noise with respect to elevation, AECOM's noise expert gave a detailed report and presentation to the Palo Alto Extended Citizen Advisory Panel for their Connecting Palo Alto Grade Separation Study process. And those meetings are actually online, YouTube videos, and you can review that presentation to that committee. And the report is also online on the Connecting Palo Alto website, but that's very fresh, and they look specifically at the question of the noise impacts of doing an elevated viaduct, a viaduct across Churchill. And they did, as I alluded earlier, they are going with the assumption of a 6-foot, they call it a parapet wall, which is just enough to block the noise from the wheel rail interface, because they won't have horn blowing. So that's all stuff that just wanted to, again, emphasize is available. The last point I wanted to make is that I would urge you not to get too focused on the high-speed rail trains, because the Caltrain business plan, if you look at that, the majority of trains by far going approximately the same speed as a lot of the high-speed rail trains will be Caltrain trains. So if you solve the noise problem, say high-speed rail never comes, or if it does come, if you solve the noise problem to your satisfaction for Caltrain, you will have essentially solved it for high-speed rail. So this is not a high-speed rail specific issue as I see it. The concerns about noise and all of that, and the gates and on and on. So this is, high-speed rail is only looking at 2 to 4 trains per hour per direction, and that's the maximum case. So it's not at all going to be the predominant rail traffic that you're dealing with, any of us. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Adrian. So confirming that those are all the hands raised and all the questions we have in chat. So we'll turn the meeting back to Councilmember Nash and Mueller for any final questions. And then we'll just note that we had planned to bring a draft comment letter to the council for consideration on September 8th, prior to the public comment period closing on September 9th, so that you'll have a chance to see the draft letter. And if there are any items that you want us to pay particular attention to, other than the noise and sound wall issues that we heard earlier, we can tune into those as we draft the comment letter. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikki. Councilmember Mueller, do you have any follow-up questions or comments?
Nope.
Yeah. I don't either on this item. And so, okay. I would like to have one additional comment, and that is to request another rail subcommittee meeting. And that would be on the status of grade crossings, and to basically do a check-in where we are currently and sort of the timeline for next steps, so that we can take a look at both the hybrid and how we're doing on the studying the viaduct, which and just discuss this at a future rail committee subcommittee meeting, please.
I'm fine with having another subcommittee meeting. That's fine.
Thank you. Are there any comments from staff?
Yeah, I think we can work with you council members to schedule a follow-up meeting. I've just mentioned briefly that I think, as you both know, the fully elevated study is on hold while we were working with a smaller staff capacity than we had earlier in the year. But we can work with you to give a more comprehensive update through a future meeting. Happy to do that.
That'd be great. One of the things that I'd like to do is just, if we could take a look at the facts as we know them for both options, so that we see exactly sort of how they align and where they're different. That would be very beneficial. And if there's, well, I can discuss this offline with you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, with that, I will, Ray.
I got a request from the public to go back to the minutes. I know we've already passed them, but it turned out so that Ms. Winkler had her hand raised prior to passing them. So I'd like to hear what her comments were on them.
Sounds great.
So,
Hi,
yes,
Mickey.
I did have a comment on the minutes, and I wanted to point out that my comment that you quote in those minutes really had to do with activating the Dumbarton Rail between Facebook and Redwood City. And I hope you can include that discussion in your next rail subcommittee meeting and give us a status on that, if you would.
So that's, I'm happy to have that also be part of what we talk about in the meeting. Just an update on that in the meeting that Councilmember Nash has requested. And then secondarily, although we've already passed the minutes, since I was the mover and the seconder and the passer, I'm going to make a friendly amendment to go ahead and just put into the minutes that the discussion was very specifically about the Dumbarton corridor between Facebook and Redwood City. I'll second that and I'll pass that.
Well done.
Okay.
We'll incorporate that clarification. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Excellent. The one other piece, as long as we're having Dumbarton Rail and the grade separation, is it would be good to get an update as to, for the public, on the middle pedestrian bicycle underpass, and just a status update there, please, too.
Actually, yeah, and while we're at it, Mr. Guy, since we're having this other meeting, maybe it's time we had a public discussion about the status of Dumbarton Rail.
Yeah, we typically, in past meetings when we have status updates to provide on these projects, we've done all three of them. So Dumbarton, the Ravenswood grade separation, and middle. So we can work with you both to calendar a follow-up meeting for all.
Okay. Thank you.
Good. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for your work today.
Welcome.
And with that, we will adjourn. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.